The fluorescent lights in the abandoned warehouse cast harsh shadows across Marcus Brennan's face as he sat bound to a metal chair, blood dripping from where his tongue used to be. The men who had done this to him thought they had silenced him forever. They had no idea that 12 years of military service had taught him dozens of ways to communicate without ever opening his mouth. What they were about to witness would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Brennan was living what most people would consider a quiet life in Millfield, Oregon. The former Army Signal Corps specialist had traded his military fatigues for flannel shirts and work boots, spending his days as a maintenance supervisor at Cascade Manufacturing, a mid-sized factory that produced automotive parts. At 34, Marcus had successfully buried his past deep enough that most people in town knew him simply as the guy who could fix anything and never caused trouble at Sullivan's Bar on Friday nights. But the past has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. Marcus had always been gifted with languages and codes. During his military service, he'd been stationed at Fort Gordon, where he'd specialized in tactical communications and signal intelligence. Beyond the standard radio protocols, he'd mastered American Sign Language, maritime flag signals, Morse code, and even obscure military hand signals used by special operations units. His commanding officers had called him a natural, someone who could find a way to communicate in any situation no matter how compromised. That particular Tuesday morning started like any other. Marcus arrived at the factory at 6:30, coffee in hand, ready to tackle a backlog of machinery repairs. The Pacific Northwest drizzle tapped against the industrial windows as he made his rounds, checking conveyor belts and hydraulic systems. Cascade Manufacturing employed about 200 people, and Marcus knew most of them by name. He'd been working there for 3 years, ever since he'd settled in Millfield after his discharge. Around 10 o'clock, while Marcus was replacing a worn bearing in the main assembly line, a man in an expensive suit approached him. The stranger looked out of place among the machinery and blue-collar workers, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the concrete floor. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confident posture that suggested he was used to being obeyed. "Marcus Brennan?" the man asked, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't immediately place. Marcus straightened up from his work, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag. "That's me. Are you looking for someone?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Viktor Kozlov. I represent certain interests that have been looking for you for quite some time." The name meant nothing to Marcus, but something about the man's demeanor set off alarm bells. His military training had taught him to read people, and everything about Viktor Kozlov screamed danger. The way he stood, the calculated movement of his eyes as they assessed the factory floor, the barely concealed bulge under his left arm that suggested a shoulder holster. "I think you've got the wrong guy," Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral. "I'm just a mechanic." Victor's smile widened. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, Marcus, we know all about your time in the Army. We know about your specialization in communications. More importantly, we know about Operation Blackbird." The blood in Marcus's veins turned to ice. Operation Blackbird was classified at the highest levels, a joint intelligence mission he'd participated in during his final year of service. It had taken place in Eastern Europe, and the details were buried so deep that even Marcus sometimes wondered if it had really happened. Only a handful of people knew about Blackbird, and most of them were dead. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Victor pulled out a manila envelope from his jacket and handed it to Marcus. "Take a look." Against his better judgment, Marcus opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, crystal-clear surveillance shots that made his stomach drop. There he was, 3 years younger, in military fatigues, standing outside a compound in what he recognized as rural Slovakia. The next photo showed him with Captain Sarah Mitchell, his commanding officer during Blackbird. The third photo was the one that nearly made him drop the envelope entirely. It showed him carrying a small metal briefcase as he exited the compound, his face clearly visible in the moonlight. That briefcase contained intelligence that could destabilize entire governments, information that was supposed to have been destroyed immediately after the mission's completion. "You remember now," Victor said, his tone casual as if they were discussing the weather. You were quite the hero, Marcus. Single-handedly infiltrating that facility, retrieving the data, getting out without raising an alarm. Impressive work. Marcus looked around the factory floor, suddenly aware that several of Victor's associates had positioned themselves near the exits. They were trying to be subtle, but to someone with his training, they might as well have been wearing signs that said, "Hired muscle." "What do you want?" Marcus asked quietly. The briefcase, of course. Or more specifically, what was in it. We know it wasn't destroyed as officially reported. Captain Mitchell was too smart for that, and so were you. She hid it somewhere before her unfortunate accident. Marcus felt his jaw clench. Sarah Mitchell's death had been ruled an accident. A car crash on a rainy night outside Fort Bragg. But Marcus had always suspected otherwise. Sarah was too careful, too experienced to lose control of her vehicle on a road she'd driven hundreds of times. Sarah's dead, Marcus said. Whatever she might have known died with her. Victor shook his head slowly. We don't think so. You see, we've been watching you for a long time, Marcus. 3 years, to be exact. We know you visit her grave every month. We know you leave flowers. Always white lilies, her favorite. We know you spend exactly 12 minutes there, and we know you sometimes trace patterns in the dirt near her headstone. Marcus's blood ran cold. He had been visiting Sarah's grave regularly, but he'd thought he was being careful about surveillance. Apparently not careful enough. We believe Captain Mitchell passed certain information to you before her death, Victor continued. Information about where the real data from Operation Blackbird is hidden. We need that information, Marcus, and we're prepared to be very persuasive in obtaining it. And if I don't have what you're looking for? Victor's expression hardened. Then we'll explore other avenues. Your landlord, Mrs. Chen, seems like a sweet old lady, and that waitress at Sullivan's bar. Rebecca, isn't it? She's quite fond of you. It would be unfortunate if anything happened to them while we continued our search. The threat was clear, and Marcus felt a familiar rage building in his chest. During his military service, he'd encountered men like Victor before, people who saw innocent lives as expendable tools to achieve their goals. He'd sworn he was done with that world, but apparently, that world wasn't done with him. I need time to think, Marcus said. Of course. You have 48 hours to consider our offer. We'll be in touch. Victor turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Marcus, don't do anything foolish like contacting your former colleagues or local law enforcement. We have eyes everywhere, and as I mentioned, there are people in this town you care about. It would be a shame if your heroic instincts put them in danger. After Victor and his men left, Marcus stood in the factory for a long time, staring at the photographs in his hands. His co-workers continued their tasks around him, oblivious to the fact that their maintenance supervisor's past had just caught up with him in the worst possible way. That evening, Marcus sat in his small apartment above Chen's hardware store, trying to process what had happened. Mrs. Chen, his 70-year-old landlord, had been like a grandmother to him since he'd moved to Millfield. Rebecca Martinez, the waitress at Sullivan's bar, had become a close friend, maybe something more if he'd ever worked up the courage to ask her out properly. The thought of either of them being hurt because of his past made him physically sick. But what Victor didn't understand was that Marcus really didn't know where Sarah had hidden the Blackbird data. She'd been paranoid in her final months, talking about insurance policies and contingency plans. But she'd never given him specific details. If the information was hidden somewhere, Sarah had taken its location to her grave. Marcus opened his laptop and began researching Viktor Kozlov. What he found wasn't encouraging. Kozlov was connected to a network of Eastern European crime families who specialized in recovering and selling classified intelligence. They had a reputation for extreme violence and a complete disregard for collateral damage. If they believed Marcus had what they wanted, they wouldn't give up easily. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself thinking about the patterns Victor had mentioned, the ones he traced near Sarah's headstone. He did that unconsciously during his visits, usually while lost in thought about their shared experiences. But now he wondered if those patterns might mean more than he'd realized. The next morning, Marcus called in sick to work and drove to Riverside Cemetery, where Sarah was buried. It was a foggy Pacific Northwest morning, the kind where the mist hung low between the evergreens and made everything seem otherworldly. Sarah's grave sat on a small hill overlooking the Cascade River, marked by a simple granite headstone that read, Captain Sarah Mitchell, beloved daughter and soldier. Marcus knelt beside the grave and tried to remember exactly what patterns he'd been tracing during his visits. It had been unconscious behavior, something he did while talking quietly to Sarah about his life in Millfield, about the people he'd met, about his struggle to find peace after military service. But as he thought about it more carefully, he realized the patterns weren't random. They were tactical communication symbols, hand signals he'd learned during specialized training. Subconsciously, he'd been signing to Sarah, using the same silent language they'd used during covert operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had taught him those specific signals during their final mission together. They were part of a specialized code she'd developed for extreme situations, where traditional communication methods were compromised. If she had hidden the Blackbird data somewhere, she might have left clues using that same code system. Marcus spent the next several hours at the cemetery, carefully examining every inch of Sarah's grave and the surrounding area. Finally, carved almost invisibly into the base of her headstone, he found what he was looking for. They were tiny marks, so small they looked like natural imperfections in the stone, unless you knew what to look for. The marks spelled out a message in Sarah's specialized tactical code. When silence is the only option, the loudest voice becomes the most dangerous. It was a phrase Sarah had used during their training, referring to the paradox of communication in hostile environments. But Marcus realized it was also a clue. Sarah had hidden something where silence was enforced, where communication was restricted or monitored. Somewhere the loudest voice would be considered dangerous. As Marcus drove back toward town, his mind raced through possibilities. Where would Sarah hide critical intelligence? It would have to be somewhere secure but accessible. Somewhere she could retrieve it if necessary, but where it would remain safe if something happened to her. Then it hit him. The Millfield Public Library had a local history section that Sarah had visited during her final leave. Marcus remembered her mentioning it because she'd been researching the area where he planned to settle after his discharge. She'd seemed unusually interested in the library's rare book collection and the old documents they kept in climate-controlled storage. Marcus parked outside the library and sat in his truck for several minutes, watching the building. It was an old Carnegie library from the early 1900s, all brick and ivy with tall windows that let in natural light. If Victor's people were watching him, they'd see him enter, but he didn't have much choice. His 48-hour deadline was approaching fast. Inside, Marcus approached the reference desk where an elderly librarian named Dorothy Haynes was cataloging returned books. He'd met her a few times during his visits to town, and she'd always been friendly. "Hello, Marcus," Dorothy said with a warm smile. "What brings you in today? Looking for repair manuals again?" "Actually, I was wondering about your local history collection. I heard you have some interesting old documents." Dorothy's eyes lit up. "Oh yes, we have some wonderful materials. Are you interested in anything specific?" "A friend of mine mentioned visiting here a few years ago. Sarah Mitchell. She was particularly interested in documents related to military history in the area." Dorothy's expression changed slightly, becoming more thoughtful. "Oh yes, I remember Miss Mitchell. Such a polite young woman. She spent quite a bit of time with our World War II correspondence collection. Very focused researcher." "Correspondence collection?" "Letters and documents donated by local families. We have boxes of materials from soldiers who served overseas." Miss Mitchell was particularly interested in communication methods used during the war. Codes, signals, that sort of thing. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Would it be possible to see that collection?" "Of course, though I should mention Miss Mitchell made a small donation to our preservation fund after her visit. She was very concerned about making sure those documents would be properly maintained for future researchers." Dorothy led Marcus to a climate-controlled room in the library's basement. The space was lined with filing cabinets and archival boxes, all carefully labeled and organized. She pulled out a specific box marked World War II Communications Local Collection. "Miss Mitchell spent most of her time with this particular box," Dorothy said. She was fascinated by a set of letters from a local soldier who served as a radio operator in the Pacific Theater. The letters contained some interesting examples of code words he used to communicate with his family back home. Marcus opened the box with hands that were slightly trembling. Inside were dozens of letters, photographs, and documents, all preserved in protective sleeves. But as he carefully went through the materials, one item immediately caught his attention. It was a letter that looked different from the others, newer paper, but aged to blend in with the historical documents. The letter was addressed to a fictional soldier's family, but the content was clearly modern. And at the bottom, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, was Sarah's signature in her distinctive handwriting. The letter appeared to be a standard family correspondence, full of mundane details about military life and expressions of homesickness. But Marcus recognized Sarah's tactical communication code embedded in seemingly random phrases and word choices. Decoding the message took him nearly an hour, working with a pencil and paper in the library's quiet reading room. When he finally cracked it, the message was clear. Insurance policies stored in Safety Deposit Box 247, First National Bank, Millfield. Key hidden behind loose brick, northwest corner foundation, Chen's hardware store. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. Trust no one with official credentials. The corruption goes higher than we thought. Use the voice when words fail you. Marcus sat back in his chair, processing the implications. Sarah had hidden the Blackbird intelligence in a safety deposit box right here in Millfield, practically under his nose for the past 3 years. The key was hidden behind his own apartment building, in a place only he would think to look. But the final line of the message troubled him. Use the voice when words fail you. It was another reference to their shared training, specifically to a contingency communication protocol they'd learned for situations where normal speech was impossible. Marcus realized that Sarah had anticipated exactly what was happening to him now. She'd known that someday people like Viktor Kozlov would come looking for the Blackbird data, and she'd prepared for the possibility that Marcus might be captured or compromised. As evening approached, Marcus made his way back to Chen's hardware store. Mrs. Chen was closing up shop when he arrived, and she greeted him with her usual warm smile. "Marcus, you look troubled," she said, her English heavily accented but clear. "Everything okay?" "Just work stress, Mrs. Chen. Nothing to worry about." But as Marcus climbed the stairs to his apartment, he could feel eyes watching him from somewhere in the gathering dusk. Victor's people were already positioning themselves for whatever came next. In his apartment, Marcus prepared for what he knew would be his final night of freedom. Tomorrow, he would have to make a choice. Give Victor what he wanted, and hope the man kept his word about leaving innocent people alone, or find another way to protect the people he cared about, while keeping the Blackbird intelligence out of the wrong hands. He spent hours staring out his window at the dark street below, occasionally catching glimpses of movement in the shadows that confirmed his suspicions about surveillance. Victor's men were patient, professional, and numerous. Even with his military training, Marcus knew he couldn't fight his way out of the situation. But as the night wore on, a plan began to form in his mind. It was desperate and dangerous, but it might be the only way to protect both the intelligence and the innocent people Victor was threatening. The plan would require him to use every skill Sarah had taught him about covert communication. And if it went wrong, if Victor's people captured him before he could execute it properly, he would need to rely on the voice Sarah had referenced in her message. Marcus had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, he would discover exactly what Sarah had meant by those words, and why she'd been so confident that even without his tongue, he would find a way to communicate the truth to the right people. The fluorescent lights in that abandoned warehouse were still hours away, but the choices that would lead him there were already being made. Marcus woke to the sound of gravel crunching under tires in the alley behind Chen's hardware store. It was 4:30 in the morning, still dark, but he'd learned to sleep lightly during his military years. Through his bedroom window, he could see the silhouettes of 3 vehicles positioning themselves strategically around the building. Victor wasn't waiting for his deadline. Moving silently through his apartment, Marcus gathered the few items he'd prepared the night before: a tactical flashlight, his old military knife, and a small mirror he'd removed from Mrs. Chen's bathroom medicine cabinet. He also grabbed the decoded message from Sarah, though he'd already memorized every word. The back exit from his apartment led to a fire escape that connected to the hardware store's roof. Marcus had discovered this route during his first week living there, part of his ingrained habit of identifying all possible exits from any location. He slipped out quietly, using skills he hadn't needed since his discharge. From the rooftop, he could see Victor's men moving into position around the building. They were good, but not good enough to account for someone with Marcus's training. He counted at least 8 operatives, which meant Victor was taking this operation seriously. Marcus made his way across the connected rooftops of downtown Millfield's historic district, using the early morning darkness as cover. His destination was the northwest corner of Chen's building, where Sarah had hidden the safety deposit box key behind a loose brick in the foundation. Finding the brick took precious minutes he didn't have. Sarah had chosen her hiding spot well. It was accessible but not obvious, positioned where someone would need to know exactly what they were looking for. When Marcus finally located it, his fingers closed around a small plastic-wrapped package containing an old-fashioned bank key and a second coded message. This message was shorter but more urgent. They have someone inside First National. Box 247 is compromised. Real location: Millfield Elementary School. Time capsule buried 1952, northwest corner playground. Map coordinates match our Budapest safe house protocol. Clock is ticking faster than you know. Marcus felt his stomach drop. If Victor's people had someone inside the bank, they'd been planning this operation for much longer than he'd realized. But Sarah's reference to the Budapest safe house protocol told him exactly where to look. During a mission in Hungary, they'd used a specific coordinate system based on architectural landmarks to identify secure locations. Millfield Elementary School was 6 blocks away, and dawn was already beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Marcus would have to move fast and hope Victor's surveillance team was still focused on his apartment building. The school sat on a large lot surrounded by mature oak trees, with a playground that had been recently renovated but still contained some original equipment from decades past. Using Sarah's coordinate system, Marcus located the northwest corner, where a 1950s-era merry-go-round had once stood, now marked only by a slight depression in the ground and a historical marker. Digging with his hands and the blade of his knife, Marcus found the time capsule 3 feet down. It was a metal container about the size of a shoebox, sealed with wax and wrapped in multiple layers of plastic. Inside, beneath fake period documents meant to disguise its true contents, was a modern waterproof case containing 3 items: a USB drive, a handwritten letter from Sarah, and something that made Marcus's blood run cold. The third item was a newspaper clipping from a Slovakian publication, dated 6 months after Operation Blackbird. The headline, translated into English in Sarah's handwriting, read, "Mass grave discovered outside Bratislava. Dozens of civilians killed in government cover-up." Sarah's letter explained everything Marcus had feared to learn. "Marcus, if you're reading this, it means they've found you. Operation Blackbird wasn't what we were told. The intelligence we retrieved didn't expose enemy operations. It exposed our own government's involvement in civilian massacres. The data on this drive contains proof that American intelligence agencies provided weapons and tactical support to Eastern European death squads in exchange for favorable trade agreements. The people hunting you aren't foreign operatives. They're American assets working to bury this information permanently. Viktor Kozlov is CIA, deep cover for 15 years. His criminal connections are real, but his ultimate loyalty is to the agency that created him. I discovered the truth 2 weeks before my accident. They killed me because I was preparing to go public, but they never found this insurance policy. The drive contains enough evidence to bring down 3 administrations and expose a network of war criminals who are still active in our government. I know they'll try to take you alive because they need to know if you've accessed this information. When they capture you, not if, when. Remember everything I taught you about silent communication. The right people are watching, but they can't help you unless you can signal them without being detected. Trust Agent Rebecca Martinez. Yes, the waitress at Sullivan's Bar. She's FBI, assigned to protect you after I reported my suspicions before my death. She's been waiting 3 years for this moment. She knows the tactical signals, and she'll know what to do when you use them. I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm sorry for dragging you into this, and I'm sorry for leaving you to finish what I started, but you're the only person I trust to see this through. Marcus sat in the dirt of the elementary school playground, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd just learned. Rebecca Martinez, the friendly waitress who'd served him coffee and made small talk for 3 years, was an undercover federal agent. Operation Blackbird had been a cover-up operation, not an intelligence-gathering mission, and Viktor Kozlov was an American agent tasked with eliminating anyone who knew the truth. The sound of vehicles approaching the school snapped Marcus back to the present. Dawn was breaking, and Victor's men had apparently realized their target had slipped away from his apartment. Marcus could see headlights turning into the school parking lot. He quickly reburied the time capsule after removing only the USB drive, which he sealed in a plastic bag and hid inside his boot. If he was captured, the drive would be his only bargaining chip, but he needed to make sure it couldn't be easily found during a search. There was no way to escape the school grounds without being seen. Victor's men were already spreading out to surround the building and playground. Marcus made a quick decision that would either save his life or end it immediately. He walked out into the open, hands raised, making no attempt to run or hide. Victor emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by 4 operatives. In the early morning light, Marcus could see that his suspicions had been correct. These weren't common criminals. They moved with military precision, carried professional equipment, and maintained tactical formations that suggested extensive training. "Good morning, Marcus," Victor said, his accent less pronounced now that he'd dropped some of his criminal persona. "I was hoping we could avoid unnecessary dramatics." "You're CIA," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Victor smiled. "Very good. Yes, I've been undercover for quite some time. Long enough to develop some rather unsavory contacts, and a reputation that opens doors in certain circles. But my ultimate loyalty has always been to my country. The country that orders the massacre of civilians in foreign nations? The country that sometimes makes difficult choices to preserve global stability. You were a soldier, Marcus. You understand that war requires moral compromises. I understand the difference between military targets and innocent families." Victor's expression hardened. "Captain Mitchell filled your head with naive idealism. She never understood the bigger picture. Sometimes preventing larger conflicts requires smaller sacrifices." Quote. 2 of Victor's men flanked Marcus while a third searched him thoroughly. They found his knife and flashlight but missed the USB drive in his boot. Marcus had learned this particular hiding technique during SERA training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape protocols that included methods for concealing critical items during capture. "Where is the intelligence, Marcus? We know you found something at the cemetery and the library. We know Sarah left you breadcrumbs to follow. Save us all some time and tell us where the data is hidden." "Sarah didn't tell me anything specific. I found some coded messages, but they just led to more questions." Victor studied Marcus's face carefully. "You know, I believe you're telling the truth about not knowing the location initially, but I also believe you've learned more in the past 24 hours than you're admitting. We're going to have to explore this topic more thoroughly." The men loaded Marcus into the back of a black SUV with tinted windows. As they drove through the awakening streets of Millfield, Marcus caught a glimpse of Sullivan's bar. The parking lot was empty, but he thought he saw movement in one of the upstairs windows where Rebecca Martinez lived in a small apartment above the restaurant. If Sarah's letter was accurate, Rebecca would be watching and waiting for him to signal her. But first, he had to survive whatever Victor was planning. The SUV turned onto an industrial road that led to the outskirts of town, passing several abandoned warehouses and manufacturing facilities that had closed during the economic downturn of the previous decade. Finally, they stopped at a concrete building that had once housed a meat processing plant. Inside, the building had been modified for interrogation purposes. The main floor had been cleared except for a few metal chairs and some equipment that Marcus recognized as torture devices. Soundproofing materials covered the walls, and the windows had been blacked out completely. "This facility has been quite useful over the years," Victor explained as his men secured Marcus to one of the chairs. "Remote enough for privacy, but close enough to town that we can keep an eye on your friends while we work." "What friends? I barely know anyone in Millfield." "Oh, I think you care more than you're admitting. Mrs. Chen, for instance. Sweet old lady, living alone above her hardware store. And Rebecca Martinez. Though I suspect you'll be interested to learn some things about Miss Martinez that might surprise you." Marcus kept his expression neutral, but Victor's comment confirmed his suspicions. If Victor knew Rebecca's real identity, it meant the operation was even more complex than Sarah had realized. "Rebecca has been playing a very long game," Victor continued. 3 years of serving you coffee, listening to your small talk, building trust. The FBI thought they were so clever, placing an asset close to you in case Sarah's insurance policy ever surfaced. What they didn't realize is that we've known about Agent Martinez from the beginning. Victor pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus a series of surveillance photos. Rebecca in FBI training at Quantico. Rebecca receives briefings from senior agents. Rebecca installed listening devices in Marcus's apartment while he was at work. She's been reporting your every move to her handlers for 3 years. Every conversation, every habit, every person you've interacted with. The FBI has been using you as bait, hoping that someday the people who killed Sarah would come looking for you and lead them to the missing intelligence. Marcus felt a cold rage building in his chest. If Victor was telling the truth, then both sides had been manipulating him. The CIA wanted to bury the truth about Operation Blackbird, while the FBI wanted to use him to expose it, and neither side cared about his safety or the safety of innocent people in Millfield. "Here's what's going to happen," Victor said, walking around Marcus's chair like a predator circling prey. "You're going to tell me everything you learned from Sarah's messages. You're going to give me the location of the Blackbird intelligence. And then you're going to help me send a message to Agent Martinez and her FBI handlers. And if I refuse?" Victor smiled. "Well, that's where things get unpleasant. You see, we need to know not just where the intelligence is hidden, but also who else might have accessed it. We need to know if you've made copies, if you've told anyone else, if there are other insurance policies we haven't discovered." Victor nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward with a medical kit. "We're going to start with some chemical assistance to help you remember details you might have forgotten. If that doesn't work, we'll move to more traditional methods of persuasion." "You mean torture?" "Such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as aggressive negotiation." The man with the medical kit prepared a syringe with some kind of clear liquid. Marcus recognized the setup from his training in resistance to interrogation. They were going to use drugs to break down his psychological defenses before moving to physical methods. But as the needle approached his arm, Marcus was already calculating his next moves. Sarah had taught him that successful resistance to interrogation wasn't about heroically withstanding pain. It was about controlling the flow of information and buying time for rescue or escape opportunities. He also knew that if Rebecca Martinez was really an FBI agent, she would be monitoring the situation and preparing some kind of response. The question was whether she could act before Victor's interrogation methods permanently damaged his ability to communicate. The drug hit his bloodstream quickly, and Marcus felt his thoughts becoming fuzzy and disconnected. Victor began asking questions, starting with basic biographical information and gradually moving toward more sensitive topics. Marcus had trained for this scenario, learning techniques to compartmentalize information and maintain some level of mental control even under chemical influence. He answered Victor's questions selectively, providing enough truth to seem cooperative while withholding the most critical details. But as the hours passed and the drugs accumulated in his system, Marcus could feel his resistance weakening. Victor was patient and methodical, asking the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies that would reveal when Marcus was lying. Finally, as afternoon sunlight filtered through the blacked-out windows, Victor asked the question Marcus had been dreading. "Where is the USB drive, Marcus? We know Sarah left you more than just coded messages. We know there's physical evidence somewhere." Marcus tried to maintain his mental defenses, but the drugs had worn down his ability to think clearly. He could feel himself on the verge of revealing the drive's location when Victor made a mistake that changed everything. "It doesn't matter," Victor said, checking his watch. "Agent Martinez should be arriving soon. We sent her a message using your phone, asking her to meet you at the old processing plant. She thinks you've discovered something important about Sarah's death and need her help. You're going to kill her. Eventually. But first, she's going to watch us extract every piece of information from your brain. Then she's going to contact her FBI handlers and tell them that the Blackbird intelligence was never found, that Sarah's insurance policy was a bluff. After that, both of you will unfortunately die in what appears to be a tragic accident." Marcus realized that Victor had just given him critical information. Rebecca was coming, which meant she was still operational and hadn't been compromised as completely as Victor believed. If Marcus could find a way to warn her or signal that this was a trap, she might be able to turn the situation around. But first, he had to survive the next phase of Victor's interrogation, because Marcus could see that his captor was losing patience, and the medical kit was being put away in favor of more direct methods of persuasion. Victor's next words confirmed Marcus's worst fears. "I think we've gotten as much cooperation as we're going to get through chemistry. Time to try a more traditional approach." The man with the medical kit stepped back as another operative approached with a toolbox that contained implements Marcus recognized from his training in torture resistance. But there was one tool that made his blood run cold: a pair of surgical scissors designed for precise cutting. "The tongue is remarkably sensitive," Victor explained, putting on surgical gloves, "and its removal sends a very clear message about the consequences of refusing to cooperate. Don't worry, Marcus, we'll cauterize the wound immediately. You won't bleed to death. You'll just never speak again." As Victor approached with the scissors, Marcus realized that Sarah's final message was about to become terrifyingly relevant. When his captors cut out his tongue, his only hope of communicating with Rebecca Martinez would be through the silent signals Sarah had taught him during their covert operations. The irony wasn't lost on him. Victor thought he was silencing Marcus permanently, but he was actually forcing him to use the one form of communication that might save both their lives. The surgical scissors felt ice-cold against Marcus's tongue as Victor positioned them carefully. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the warehouse floor, and Marcus could taste the metallic tang of his own blood where the blades had already made contact. "Last chance, Marcus," Victor said, his voice steady and professional. "The location of the USB drive. Save yourself unnecessary suffering." Marcus met Victor's eyes and made his choice. He bit down hard on his own tongue, not enough to cause serious damage, but enough to draw blood and show defiance. Victor's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw something flicker behind his eyes, perhaps respect for an adversary who wouldn't break easily. The cutting was precise and clinical. Victor had clearly done this before, working quickly to minimize blood loss while ensuring maximum psychological impact. Marcus fought against the restraints, not from pain, but from the primal human instinct to protect himself from mutilation. The taste of blood filled his mouth, and the world seemed to narrow to a single point of agony. But even as Victor worked, Marcus was thinking tactically. The USB drive remained hidden in his boot, and Rebecca Martinez was supposedly on her way to what she believed was a meeting with him. If he could survive the next few minutes and find a way to signal her, there might still be a chance to turn this situation around. Victor stepped back, holding up a piece of Marcus's tongue with surgical forceps. "Cauterization next," he announced to his men. "We need him conscious and coherent for what comes next." The smell of burning flesh filled the warehouse as Victor sealed the wound with a medical cauterizer. Marcus's vision blurred from shock and pain, but he forced himself to remain alert. Everything Sarah had taught him about resistance and survival was being put to the ultimate test. "Excellent," Victor said, cleaning his instruments. "Now we wait for Agent Martinez to arrive. When she sees what we've done to you, she'll be much more cooperative about contacting her FBI handlers with our message." One of Victor's men approached and whispered something in his ear. Victor nodded and checked his watch. "She's 15 minutes out. That gives us time to prepare a proper welcome." Marcus tested his ability to move his remaining tongue. The pain was excruciating, but he could still manipulate what was left. More importantly, he still had full use of his hands, arms, and facial muscles. The tactical communication system Sarah had taught him relied on much more than just manual signals. Victor's men began positioning themselves around the warehouse, setting up what was clearly an ambush. They placed explosive charges near the main entrance and positioned sniper rifles at elevated positions. Whatever they were planning for Rebecca's arrival, it wasn't intended to be a negotiation. "You know what I find most interesting about this situation?" Victor said, settling into a chair across from Marcus. "Agent Martinez has been living a complete lie for 3 years. She's built genuine relationships with people in Millfield, including you. She's going to walk into this warehouse thinking she's saving someone she cares about, and instead she's going to watch that person die slowly." Marcus tried to speak, forgetting momentarily about his condition. Only a wet, gurgling sound emerged, followed by fresh blood. Victor smiled at the reminder of what he'd done. "The psychological impact will be devastating," Victor continued. "We've found that nothing breaks an agent's resistance quite like watching someone they've grown attached to suffer. Agent Martinez will tell us everything we want to know about FBI operations, and then she'll help us send a message to her superiors that will end their investigation permanently." Through the blacked-out windows, Marcus could hear the sound of a vehicle approaching. Victor's men took their positions, and the warehouse fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of an engine. But something was wrong with the approaching sound. Instead of a single vehicle, Marcus could detect multiple engines, and they were moving in a coordinated pattern that suggested tactical deployment rather than a simple arrival. Victor heard it too. He stood up quickly, his relaxed demeanor replaced by sharp alertness. "That's not one car," he said to his men. "Rodriguez, check the perimeter. Johnson, get on the radio and find out what's happening out there." The radio crackled with urgent voices as Victor's men reported multiple vehicles surrounding the warehouse. Marcus felt a surge of hope. If Rebecca Martinez was really FBI, she apparently hadn't come alone. "Shit," Victor muttered, looking at a tablet that displayed feeds from security cameras around the building. FBI tactical team, at least 12 agents. Someone tipped them off. Victor spun around to face Marcus, his eyes blazing with fury. "You clever bastard! You found a way to signal them before we picked you up, didn't you?" Marcus had done no such thing, but he wasn't about to correct Victor's assumption. The truth was probably that Rebecca had been monitoring the situation more closely than anyone realized, and she detected signs that Marcus was in trouble. "Sir," one of Victor's men called out, "we've got movement on all sides. They're setting up a perimeter, but they're not advancing. Looks like they want to negotiate." A loudspeaker crackled to life outside the warehouse. "This is Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, FBI. The building is surrounded. We know you have Marcus Brennan inside. We're prepared to discuss terms for his safe release." Victor laughed bitterly. "Terms? She has no idea what she's dealing with." He grabbed a radio and responded. "Agent Martinez, how lovely to hear your voice. I'm afraid Mr. Brennan is indisposed at the moment. Perhaps you'd like to come inside and see for yourself." "Negative. You come out with your hands visible and we'll talk." "I don't think so. You see, your friend Marcus has something that belongs to us, and we're not leaving without it. But I'll make you a deal. Come inside, alone, unarmed, and we'll discuss this like civilized people." There was a long pause before Rebecca's voice came back over the loudspeaker. "I'm coming in. No weapons, no backup. But if anything happens to me, my team has orders to level this building." Victor smiled. "Perfect. She's going to walk right into our trap." But Marcus noticed something Victor had missed. Rebecca's voice over the loudspeaker had contained subtle stress patterns and word choices that matched a tactical communication protocol Sarah had taught him. Rebecca wasn't just announcing her intentions to Victor. She was sending coded messages to Marcus about her real plan. The phrase civilized people had been emphasized in a way that referenced a specific hand signal combination. Level this building contained timing information. Rebecca was telling Marcus that she had a coordinated assault planned, and she needed him to be ready to signal her team about threats inside the warehouse. The main door opened slowly, and Rebecca Martinez entered with her hands raised. She looked exactly the same as always. Jeans, flannel shirt, work boots. But Marcus could see the difference now that he knew her real identity. Her posture was more alert, her eyes constantly assessing the tactical situation, her movements controlled and precise. "Well, well," Victor said, approaching Rebecca with two of his men flanking her. "The famous Agent Martinez. You've been playing your role very convincingly for 3 years." "Where is Marcus?" Rebecca demanded, scanning the warehouse until her eyes found him tied to the chair. Marcus saw her take in his condition, the blood around his mouth, the obvious signs of torture. Her expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. "As you can see, Mr. Brennan has been reluctant to cooperate with our investigation. We've had to employ some persuasive techniques." Rebecca's eyes met Marcus's across the warehouse floor. At that moment, Marcus realized she was waiting for him to give her tactical information about the threats in the building. She needed to know how many hostiles, their positions, their weapons, and any booby traps before her team could move. This was the moment Sarah had prepared him for. This was why she'd spent countless hours teaching him silent communication methods that could work even in the most compromised situations. Marcus began with subtle facial expressions, using micro-movements of his eyebrows, cheeks, and remaining tongue to convey information. 8 hostiles total. 2 with rifles in elevated positions. Explosives at the main entrance. Victor is armed with a pistol. Other weapons distributed throughout the team. Rebecca's training allowed her to read his signals, and she acknowledged reception with an almost imperceptible nod. But she needed more information, and Marcus could see her prompting him for details about the explosives and sniper positions. "Your friend seems to be trying to communicate with you," Victor observed, noticing the exchange. "How touching." Unfortunately, his capacity for speech has been permanently impaired. "You're a monster," Rebecca said, but Marcus could tell she was buying time while processing the tactical information he'd provided. "I'm a patriot," Victor replied. "Sometimes protecting your country requires making hard choices." Sarah Mitchell never understood that. She was going to destroy decades of carefully constructed foreign policy relationships because she couldn't stomach the realities of international politics. "You mean because she couldn't stomach war crimes?" "I mean because she was naive about how the world actually works." While Victor and Rebecca continued their conversation, Marcus was using more complex hand signals to provide additional intelligence. He indicated the timing of guard rotations, the positions of weapons caches, and most importantly, the fact that Victor's team was planning to kill Rebecca regardless of any information she might provide. Rebecca caught that last signal and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She was no longer playing for time. She was preparing for immediate action. "You know what I think," Rebecca said to Victor. "I think you're the naive one. You actually believe you can torture an American citizen, murder a federal agent, and walk away from this." "Oh, but that's exactly what's going to happen. You see, according to our intelligence, this warehouse is about to suffer a tragic gas explosion. Faulty equipment, very dangerous. Unfortunately, you and Mr. Brennan will be caught in the blast before my team and I can escape safely." Victor nodded to one of his men, who began preparing what looked like incendiary devices. Marcus realized they were planning to burn the warehouse down with him and Rebecca inside, making their deaths look accidental while destroying any evidence of torture or interrogation. But Marcus had been watching Rebecca carefully, and he could see she was ready to act. Her hand was positioned near a concealed radio transmitter, and her posture suggested she was about to give her team the signal to breach the building. Marcus made a series of rapid hand signals. "Now, explosive entry, northeast corner, avoid main entrance." Rebecca's response was immediate. She activated her transmitter and dove for cover behind a concrete pillar as the northeast wall of the warehouse exploded inward in a shower of concrete and steel. FBI tactical agents poured through the breach using flashbang grenades and coordinated fire to neutralize Victor's men. The warehouse erupted in chaos as automatic weapons fire echoed off the concrete walls and smoke filled the air. Marcus threw himself sideways in his chair, hoping to avoid the crossfire while trying to position himself where Rebecca's team could see him. A stray bullet shattered the chair leg, and he crashed to the floor, still bound but now mobile enough to seek better cover. Through the smoke and gunfire, Marcus could see Victor attempting to reach the main entrance where his team had presumably prepared an escape route. But Rebecca had anticipated this, and FBI agents were already in position to cut off his retreat. Victor spun around, his pistol drawn, looking for a hostage or a human shield. His eyes locked on Marcus, who was struggling to free himself from the remains of the chair. Victor began moving toward him, but Rebecca appeared from behind the concrete pillar. "Drop your weapon," she shouted, her service pistol trained on Victor's center mass. Victor smiled and kept his gun pointed at Marcus. "I don't think so, Agent Martinez. You're going to let me walk out of here, or your friend is going to suffer even more than he already has. The building is surrounded. There's nowhere for you to go." "There's always somewhere to go when you have the right connections. But first, I need that USB drive. Mr. Brennan is going to tell me where it is, or I'm going to put a bullet in his head." Marcus looked up at Victor from his position on the floor. Even without his tongue, even bound and bleeding, he knew exactly how to communicate what Victor needed to hear. Using hand signals that Victor would interpret as surrender and cooperation, Marcus began indicating that the USB drive was hidden in his boot. But the signals he was actually sending to Rebecca were completely different. Victor was wearing body armor. Center mass shots wouldn't be effective. He had a backup weapon in an ankle holster. His escape plan involved a helicopter that was probably already inbound. Rebecca processed this information while maintaining her weapon's sight picture on Victor. When Marcus finished his signals, she adjusted her aim slightly upward, targeting the only part of Victor's head that was visible above his tactical vest. "Last chance," Victor said, pressing his pistol against Marcus's forehead. "The drive location, or he dies." Marcus met Rebecca's eyes one final time and gave her a single, clear signal: take the shot. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse with finality. Victor's body crumpled to the concrete floor, and his weapon skittered away across the dusty ground. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Marcus's labored breathing and the distant chatter of FBI tactical radios. Rebecca rushed to Marcus's side, cutting his restraints with a tactical knife. "Medical team to the warehouse. We need immediate medical attention for the victim," she said into her radio. Marcus tried to speak, forgetting again about his condition. Rebecca saw his frustration and pulled out a notebook and pen. "Can you write?" she asked. Marcus nodded and took the pen with shaking hands. His first written message was simple: USB drive in my boot. Sarah's insurance policy. Everything Victor said was true. Rebecca retrieved the drive and secured it as evidence while paramedics worked on Marcus's injuries. The warehouse was quickly filled with FBI crime scene technicians, medical personnel, and agents debriefing the tactical team. As Marcus was being prepared for transport to the hospital, he wrote another message for Rebecca. "How long have you known about me?" Rebecca looked at the question and then back at Marcus. "Since the day you moved to Millfield. Sarah contacted the FBI a week before her death. She was convinced the CIA was going to kill her, and she asked us to protect you in case they ever came looking for her insurance policy." 3 years of my life, Marcus wrote. All a lie? Rebecca considered her answer carefully. The protection assignment was real, but the friendship, that became real too. I wasn't supposed to care about what happened to you, but I did. Sarah was right about a lot of things, including her assessment of your character. Marcus nodded, understanding more than Rebecca might have expected. In his final written message before the paramedics took him away, he expressed something that had been building in his mind throughout the entire ordeal. Sarah's work isn't finished. There are more people involved in this conspiracy. Victor was just one piece of a much larger operation. Rebecca read the message and met Marcus's eyes. I know, and we're going to need your help to find them all. As the ambulance pulled away from the warehouse, Marcus realized that losing his tongue might have been the least of his sacrifices. The evidence on Sarah's USB drive was going to expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the American intelligence community. The people responsible for Operation Blackbird and dozens of other cover-ups would do anything to prevent that information from becoming public. His ordeal in the warehouse was just the beginning. The real fight was about to start, and Marcus would have to find new ways to communicate not just with allies like Rebecca, but with a world that needed to hear the truth about what had been done in their name. The silent signals Sarah had taught him had saved his life, but now he would need to learn an entirely different kind of communication. How to speak truth to power when you no longer have a voice. The secure FBI medical facility in Portland felt more like a fortress than a hospital. Marcus had been transferred there 2 days after the warehouse incident, and every hallway was patrolled by federal agents. Even his hospital room had bulletproof glass and electronic surveillance equipment that monitored not just his vital signs, but every person who entered or left. Marcus stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, still adjusting to his new reality. The surgical team had done excellent work reconstructing what they could, but speaking would never be possible again. The doctors had explained that he could eventually learn to use an electronic voice device, but for now, his only means of communication were writing and the tactical signals that had saved his life. Rebecca Martinez entered his room carrying a tablet computer and wearing her real identity like a completely different set of clothes. Gone were the casual flannel shirts and work boots. Agent Martinez wore a crisp business suit and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to conducting high-level federal investigations. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, pulling up a chair beside his bed. Marcus reached for the notebook they'd given him and wrote, like someone who just discovered his entire life was a lie. Rebecca read the message and nodded. "I understand that feeling. What I told you in the warehouse was true. The assignment was real, but the friendship became real too. I know that doesn't make the deception any easier to process." "What happens now?" Marcus wrote. "That depends on what's on Sarah's USB drive. Our cybersecurity team has been analyzing it for the past 48 hours. And what they've found is extensive." Rebecca opened her tablet and showed Marcus a series of documents and photographs. The evidence Sarah had compiled was staggering in its scope and detail. Operation Blackbird was just one of dozens of covert operations, where American intelligence agencies had provided support to foreign death squads, authoritarian regimes, and criminal organizations in exchange for strategic advantages. These operations spanned 3 decades, Rebecca explained. Different administrations, different agency directors, but the same core group of operatives coordinating the activities. Viktor Kozlov was a mid-level player. The people at the top are still active, still in positions of power. Marcus wrote, how many people did they kill? Conservative estimate, thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. The operations were designed to look like local conflicts or criminal activity, but American intelligence was providing weapons, training, tactical support, and most importantly, intelligence about targets. Rebecca scrolled through more documents, showing Marcus bank records, communication intercepts, and photographic evidence that painted a picture of systematic atrocities carried out with American government support. Sarah wasn't just a whistleblower, Rebecca continued. She was building a case that could bring down the entire network. Names, dates, financial records, operational details, everything needed to prosecute the people responsible. Why didn't she go public before they killed her? Marcus wrote. She tried. Sarah approached several journalists, but the stories were killed before publication. She contacted congressional oversight committees, but the investigations were mysteriously terminated. She even reached out to international human rights organizations, but her evidence was dismissed as unverifiable. Rebecca paused, looking directly at Marcus. The corruption goes deeper than just intelligence agencies. The network Sarah uncovered includes federal judges, congressional leaders, media executives, and corporate executives who profited from these operations. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. So what makes you think this time will be different? Because Sarah was smart enough to build multiple insurance policies. The USB drive you recovered isn't the only copy of this evidence. She created a dead man's switch. If certain conditions aren't met within a specific time frame, copies of all this evidence get automatically transmitted to journalists, foreign governments, and international criminal courts. What conditions? Marcus wrote. That's where it gets complicated. Sarah's dead man's switch requires verification from 2 specific people. You and someone identified only as Guardian Angel. We know you're one of the keys, but we haven't been able to identify the second person. Rebecca showed Marcus a coded message from Sarah's files. This was in her personal effects, sealed in an envelope with instructions that it would only be opened if something happened to her. It contains what appears to be coordinates and a time-sensitive communication protocol. Marcus studied the message, recognizing Sarah's tactical coding system. The coordinates referenced a location in Washington, D.C., and the protocol described a specific sequence of signals to be used at that location at a predetermined time. Sarah wants me to go to D.C., Marcus wrote. It appears so. But Marcus, there's something else you need to understand. Viktor Kozlov's death hasn't ended this threat. Our intelligence suggests that his handlers are already moving to contain the situation. They know about Sarah's evidence, and they know you're the key to accessing it. As if summoned by Rebecca's words, another FBI agent entered the room. Agent David Chen, no relation to Marcus's landlord, was a cybersecurity specialist who looked like he hadn't slept in days. We've got a problem, Agent Chen announced. Someone just tried to hack into Sarah Mitchell's dead man's switch system. They didn't succeed, but they came close enough to trigger some automated responses. Rebecca stood up quickly. What kind of responses? The system sent out preliminary alerts to several international news organizations. If someone tries to hack it again, or if the verification protocol isn't completed within 72 hours, all the evidence gets released automatically. Marcus wrote frantically, so we have 3 days to get to D.C. and complete Sarah's protocol? Assuming we can figure out who Guardian Angel is and get them to participate, Rebecca confirmed. But traveling to D.C. puts you directly in the heart of enemy territory. These people have resources we can barely imagine, and they'll know we're coming. Agent Chen pulled out his own tablet, showing them satellite imagery of various locations around Washington. We've identified the coordinates from Sarah's message. It's the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, specifically a location near Panel 23E, where several soldiers from Sarah's father's unit are commemorated. Her father served in Vietnam, Marcus wrote. Captain James Mitchell, killed in action in 1971. Sarah visited his name on the memorial every year on the anniversary of his death. But according to her coded message, this year's visit has to include the verification protocol. Rebecca studied the tactical implications. The memorial is completely exposed, surrounded by open ground with multiple sightlines for snipers. If we're going to do this, we'll need a full tactical team and extensive security preparations. Marcus wrote, "What if Guardian Angel doesn't show up?" Quote, "Then Sarah's evidence gets released automatically, but without the verification protocol, it might be dismissed as fabricated or unreliable. The people responsible could claim it's disinformation and use their media connections to discredit it." Agent Chen added, "But if we do complete the protocol successfully, Sarah's system will release the evidence through secure channels to international criminal courts, foreign intelligence agencies, and journalists in multiple countries simultaneously. It would be much harder to suppress or discredit." Marcus realized that Sarah had designed her insurance policy to require courage from the people she trusted most. She wasn't just asking him to expose the truth. She was asking him to risk his life in the most dangerous possible way, standing exposed in the heart of Washington, while the most powerful and ruthless people in the American intelligence community tried to stop him. "There's one more thing," Rebecca said, her expression grave. "Sarah's message includes a personal note for you." She handed Marcus a sealed envelope with his name written in Sarah's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. "Marcus, if you're reading this, then everything I feared has come to pass. I'm sorry for the burden I'm placing on you, but you're the only person I trust to see this through. The signals I taught you weren't just for survival. They were for this moment. Guardian Angel will know the countersigns, and together you can complete what we started. Remember, sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is exposing your country's crimes. Be brave, my friend. The truth is worth any sacrifice." Marcus folded the letter carefully and looked up at Rebecca and Agent Chen. Both agents were watching him, waiting for his decision about whether to risk everything on Sarah's final mission. Outside his hospital room window, Marcus could see the lights of Portland spread out below. Somewhere in that city, Mrs. Chen was probably wondering why her tenant had disappeared so suddenly. The people of Millfield were going about their normal lives, unaware that their quiet maintenance supervisor had become the key to exposing one of the largest government conspiracies in American history. Marcus picked up his pen and wrote a single word that would determine the fate of Sarah's evidence and potentially reshape the American intelligence community. "Yes." Rebecca nodded grimly. "Then we leave for Washington tomorrow. God help us all." The private jet descended through the gray Washington, D.C. morning, and Marcus pressed his face to the window to watch the familiar landmarks emerge from the clouds. The Capitol Dome, the Washington Monument, the sprawling complex of federal buildings that housed the very agencies Sarah had died trying to expose. Somewhere in those buildings, powerful people were probably tracking his arrival and preparing their response. Rebecca sat across from him, studying surveillance photographs and tactical maps on her tablet. The FBI had assembled a protection detail of 12 agents, but everyone understood that if the conspiracy Sarah had uncovered was as extensive as the evidence suggested, there might be hostile elements within federal law enforcement itself. "We've identified 3 potential Guardian Angel candidates," Rebecca said, showing Marcus a series of personnel files. All former military with connections to Sarah or Operation Blackbird. The first file belonged to Colonel Patricia Hayes, Sarah's former commanding officer who now worked at the Pentagon. The second was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a communications specialist who had served alongside both Sarah and Marcus during their overseas deployments. The third file showed a woman Marcus didn't recognize, Major Elizabeth Crane, currently assigned to Army Intelligence. "Any of these names familiar?" Rebecca asked. Marcus shook his head and wrote in his notebook. Sarah was careful about compartmentalizing information. If she chose a guardian angel, it would be someone I wouldn't necessarily know about. The memorial protocol is scheduled for 1,400 hours, exactly when Sarah's father was killed 32 years ago. That gives us 6 hours to prepare and identify which of these candidates is guardian angel. Agent Chen, who had accompanied them on the flight, looked up from his laptop where he was monitoring Sarah's dead man switch system. The countdown timer is still active, 54 hours remaining before automatic release. but I'm seeing increased attempts to probe the system's defenses. How many attempts? Rebecca asked. 17 in the past 6 hours. Someone is getting desperate. The FBI safe house in Georgetown looked like an ordinary townhouse from the outside, but Marcus could see the subtle modifications that marked it as a federal facility. Reinforced windows, sophisticated security cameras, communication equipment disguised as normal household items. The basement had been converted into a tactical operations center with multiple computer workstations and communications gear. Rebecca's team spread out maps of the National Mall and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, identifying sightlines, escape routes, and potential threat positions. The memorial's location made tactical security nearly impossible. It was surrounded by open ground with multiple elevated positions that could conceal snipers. We'll have counter-sniper teams positioned here, here, and here, Rebecca explained, pointing to locations on the map. But the memorial itself is too exposed for us to provide close protection without being obvious about it. Marcus wrote, Sarah chose this location for a reason. It had to be somewhere public, somewhere that would be difficult for them to attack without risking exposure. Or she chose it because she knew the emotional significance would motivate you to complete the mission regardless of the risk, Agent Chen observed grimly. At noon, Rebecca received a phone call that changed everything. Colonel Patricia Hayes had been found dead in her Pentagon office, apparently from a heart attack. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had been killed in what appeared to be a random mugging outside his apartment in Alexandria. Within the span of 12 hours, 2 of their 3 Guardian Angel candidates had died. That leaves Major Elizabeth Crane, Rebecca said, ending the call. But we can't locate her. She didn't report for duty this morning, and her apartment appears to have been hastily abandoned. Marcus felt a familiar chill. Either Major Crane was Guardian Angel and had gone into hiding to avoid the fate of the other candidates, or she was dead too and they were walking into a trap. We could postpone, Agent Chen suggested. Wait for the automatic release and hope the evidence speaks for itself. Marcus wrote furiously, No. Sarah designed this protocol for a reason. The evidence needs to be verified by people who understand its significance. Without that verification, it's just data that can be dismissed or discredited. Rebecca checked her watch. 1,400 hours is in 2 hours. If we're going to do this, we need to leave now. The motorcade to the National Mall consisted of 3 unmarked vehicles with FBI tactical teams, but Marcus knew their enemies would be watching. Professional surveillance would identify the federal agents immediately, and any attempt to provide obvious security would only confirm that something important was happening at the memorial. As they approached the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Marcus could see tourists and visitors moving slowly along the black granite wall, many of them touching names or leaving flowers. The memorial's design created an emotional impact that never failed to affect him. The way the wall emerged from the earth and gradually rose to its full height, the way visitors were drawn down into the space as if descending into the earth itself. Guardian Angel should already be in position, Rebecca said through her radio earpiece. Look for someone displaying the recognition signals Sarah described in her protocol. Marcus walked slowly toward panel 23E, scanning the visitors around the memorial. Sarah's protocol required him to approach her father's name at exactly 1,400 hours and begin the tactical communication sequence she had specified. Guardian Angel was supposed to observe the signals and respond with countersigns that would verify both their identities. At 1,359 hours, Marcus positioned himself in front of panel 23E, where Captain James Mitchell's name was etched into the black granite along with hundreds of others. He could feel the weight of history and sacrifice represented by the wall, but he also felt the weight of the present moment and the lives that depended on what happened next. The tactical signals Sarah had specified were complex, requiring precise hand and arm movements that would appear casual to most observers, but would be unmistakable to someone with the right training. Marcus began the sequence, using gestures that appeared to be respectful touching of the wall but were actually coded communications. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Tourists continued their quiet pilgrimages along the wall, FBI agents maintained their concealed positions, and Marcus continued signaling according to Sarah's protocol. Then, from the corner of his eye, he detected movement that made his pulse quicken. A woman in her 50s, wearing civilian clothes but moving with unmistakable military bearing, approached panel 23E from the opposite direction. She appeared to be studying names on the wall, But Marcus could see that she was actually observing his signals and preparing to respond. The woman began her own sequence of tactical communications, using the countersigns Sarah had specified in her protocol. But as she signaled, Marcus realized something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't Major Elizabeth Crane or any of the other candidates Rebecca had identified. It was Sarah Mitchell. Older, with graying hair and surgical scars that suggested extensive reconstructive surgery, but unmistakably the woman Marcus had thought was dead for 3 years. Sarah was alive, and she was guardian angel. Marcus's shock must have shown on his face, because Sarah signaled for him to continue the protocol without showing recognition. But his mind was reeling. If Sarah was alive, then whose body had been buried after the car crash? How had she faked her death convincingly enough to fool federal investigators? And why had she allowed him to believe she was dead while he was being hunted by Viktor Kozlov's people? Sarah completed her countersign sequence and moved closer to Marcus, pretending to study the names on the wall while speaking quietly. I know you have questions, but right now we need to complete the verification protocol. Rebecca's team is being watched by at least 6 hostile operatives, and we have maybe 10 minutes before they realize what's happening. Marcus signaled, "How are you alive?" The car crash was real, but I survived with severe injuries. I've been in deep cover for 3 years, gathering additional evidence and preparing for this moment. The woman they buried was a Jane Doe who matched my physical profile. Why didn't you tell me? Because if you had known I was alive, you would have acted differently. Viktor Kozlov's people would have detected the deception, and both of us would be dead now. Sarah pulled out a small electronic device that looked like a smartphone but was clearly something more sophisticated. This is the master key for the dead man's switch system. It requires biometric verification from both of us to complete the evidence release. Marcus placed his thumb on the device's scanner while Sarah did the same. The screen displayed a countdown timer, 30 seconds to complete the final verification sequence. Marcus, Sarah said quietly, I need you to know that everything I told you about the conspiracy was true. But it's worse than even I realized. The network we're exposing includes people at the highest levels of government, including some who are supposed to be investigating these crimes. Quote, the device beeped softly, indicating successful verification. Sarah's evidence was now being transmitted to secure servers around the world, beyond the reach of the people who had spent 3 years trying to suppress it. But as Marcus felt a moment of triumph, he also noticed Rebecca speaking urgently into her radio. Something was wrong with the FBI security perimeter. Sarah, Marcus signaled, we need to leave. Now. Sarah followed his gaze and saw what he had detected. Men in civilian clothes moving with tactical precision toward their position. Not FBI agents, but operatives from the conspiracy they had just exposed. They're not here to arrest us, Sarah said grimly. They're here to eliminate the only 2 people who can verify the authenticity of the evidence. Marcus and Sarah began moving away from Panel 23E, but the hostile operatives were closing in from multiple directions. Rebecca's FBI team was engaged with other threats around the memorial's perimeter, leaving Marcus and Sarah exposed in the center of the killing ground. As the first shots rang out across the National Mall, Marcus realized that Sarah's insurance policy had worked exactly as designed. The evidence was now beyond their enemy's reach, transmitted to dozens of secure locations around the world. But whether Marcus and Sarah would survive to see justice done was about to be determined in the next few minutes of gunfire and chaos around the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The first gunshot shattered the solemn atmosphere around the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, sending tourists screaming and running for cover. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her behind one of the larger memorial installations as bullets sparked off the black granite wall where they had been standing moments before. FBI! FBI! Active shooter situation! Rebecca's voice carried across the National Mall as her tactical team engaged the hostile operatives. But Marcus could see that they were outnumbered and outgunned. The conspiracy's people had come prepared for war. Sarah pulled a concealed pistol from her jacket and checked the magazine. I've been planning for this moment for 3 years, she said grimly. These aren't government agents anymore. They're assassins with official credentials, and they have orders to kill us both and retrieve that verification device. Marcus signaled rapidly. How many are there? At least 12 that I can see. Professional military contractors, probably former special operations. They've been tracking our movements since we landed in D.C. Another burst of automatic weapons fire forced them to press closer to their cover. Marcus could hear the distinctive crack of high-powered sniper rifles from elevated positions around the memorial area. The attackers had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that would make escape nearly impossible. But Marcus noticed something the attackers might have missed. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial's unique design created acoustic properties that could work in their favor. Sound bounced off the granite walls in predictable patterns, and someone with the right training could use those patterns to communicate over distances without being detected. Marcus began tapping out Morse code on the granite wall behind them, using the stone's natural resonance to send a message to Rebecca's position. The code was simple but critical: 12 hostiles, elevated positions northwest and southeast, sniper teams on Lincoln Memorial steps. From her position 50 yards away, Rebecca responded with her own coded tapping: back up en route, hold position, do not attempt to move. But Sarah was already planning their next move. Marcus, I need you to create a distraction while I work my way toward those sniper positions. Can you keep their attention focused on this location for about 3 minutes? Marcus nodded and immediately began using the tactical communication signals Sarah had taught him, but this time he was signaling to the attackers themselves. Using hand signals visible from the sniper positions, he began transmitting what appeared to be surrender negotiations. The ruse worked. The hostile fire slackened as the attackers tried to interpret Marcus's signals and determine whether he was attempting to surrender or communicate with accomplices. During this brief lull, Sarah slipped away from their position and began moving toward the Lincoln Memorial. Marcus continued his false surrender signals while mentally tracking Sarah's progress. He could see muzzle flashes from the sniper positions as they tried to acquire targets. But Sarah was using the memorial's landscaping and architectural features to mask her movement. Then something unexpected happened. Additional gunfire erupted from positions Marcus hadn't identified, but this time it was directed at the original attackers. A second group of operatives had arrived, and they were engaging the conspiracy's assassins with coordinated precision. Rebecca's voice came through on a loudspeaker. "Second FBI tactical team on site. Hostile operatives, you are surrounded. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." But Marcus realized these weren't FBI reinforcements. The new arrivals were moving with different tactical signatures, using different communication protocols, and most importantly, they were specifically targeting the conspiracy's people while avoiding harm to Marcus, Sarah, and Rebecca's team. Sarah's voice came through on a radio she had apparently taken from one of the downed attackers. "Marcus, the cavalry has arrived, but they're not who you think they are." "Who are they?" Marcus signaled back using the radio's tactical channel. "International Criminal Court investigators." Turns out I wasn't the only one building a case against this conspiracy. The evidence we just transmitted triggered a multinational response that's been years in the making. The battle around the memorial intensified as the conspiracy's operatives found themselves caught between FBI agents and international law enforcement officers. But the most dangerous threat remained the sniper teams on elevated positions, and Marcus could see that Sarah was still working her way toward them. Marcus made a decision that went against every survival instinct he possessed. He broke from cover and ran directly toward the center of the memorial, making himself the most visible target possible, while using tactical signals to coordinate the various law enforcement teams converging on the area. His gamble worked. The snipers focused their attention on him, allowing Sarah to close distance on their positions while FBI and international agents advanced from other directions. But Marcus found himself pinned down in the most exposed part of the memorial with nowhere to hide and bullets striking the granite around him. That's when he saw something that made him understand the true scope of Sarah's planning. Among the international officers advancing on the sniper positions, he recognized faces from their old military unit. Captain Torres, who was supposed to be dead. Sergeant Williams, who had been reported killed in action 2 years earlier. Major Hendricks, officially listed as missing in action. Sarah hadn't just faked her own death. She had orchestrated the apparent deaths of multiple people who possessed knowledge about Operation Blackbird and similar operations. For 3 years, she had been building a shadow army of officially dead soldiers who could operate without oversight or political interference. The sniper fire stopped abruptly as Sarah's people reached the elevated positions. Marcus could see bodies falling from the Lincoln Memorial steps and hear the distinctive sounds of close-quarters combat. Within minutes, the memorial area fell silent except for the moans of wounded attackers and the professional chatter of law enforcement teams securing the area. Sarah appeared beside Marcus, helping him to his feet. Her face was grim but satisfied. "It's over, Marcus. The conspiracy is exposed, and the people responsible are either dead or in custody." Rebecca approached them, her tactical vest torn and her face streaked with dirt. "We've got 12 hostile operatives down, 3 in custody. But Sarah, we need to talk about your methods. Faking the deaths of federal personnel is a serious crime, even if your motives were pure." Sarah smiled for the first time since Marcus had seen her at the memorial. "Agent Martinez, check your secure communications. I think you'll find that certain pardons and legal immunities have already been arranged at the highest levels of government." Rebecca's radio crackled with a message that made her expression change completely. After listening for several minutes, she looked back at Sarah with something approaching awe. "The President of the United States just issued executive pardons for all personnel involved in Operation Guardian Angel," Rebecca said. "Apparently, this has been a sanctioned operation from the beginning, but at classification levels so high that even the FBI wasn't fully briefed." Marcus wrote quickly in his notebook, "So the conspiracy we exposed, how high did it really go?" Sarah took the notebook and wrote her response. "High enough that only a president could authorize the kind of operation needed to root it out. Everything we've done for the past 3 years has been building toward this moment." As federal agents and international investigators processed the crime scene, Marcus and Sarah walked slowly along the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The tourists had been evacuated, but the memorial itself remained untouched by the violence that had erupted around it. "Your father would be proud," Marcus signaled to Sarah as they stood before Captain James Mitchell's name on the wall. "I hope so," Sarah replied. "But this isn't really finished. The people we exposed today were just the operational level. The political and corporate figures who enabled these operations are still out there, and they'll try to rebuild their networks. So what happens next?" Sarah pointed to the electronic device that had transmitted their evidence to secure servers around the world. "Next, we testify before international criminal courts. We help prosecutors build cases against war criminals who thought they were untouchable. And we made sure that Operation Blackbird was the last of its kind." 6 months later, Marcus stood in a federal courthouse in The Hague, using an electronic voice device to provide testimony to the International Criminal Court. The conspiracy Sarah had exposed had resulted in the largest war crimes investigation in modern history, with indictments reaching into the highest levels of American and European governments. Sarah sat beside him at the witness table, finally able to use her real name again after 3 years of living as a ghost. The evidence they had preserved and transmitted had proven unassailable, resulting in convictions and resignations that reshaped international intelligence operations. But the most significant change wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines. It was in the way Marcus had learned to communicate despite his disability. The tactical signals Sarah had taught him had evolved into a new form of advocacy, helping other trauma survivors find ways to tell their stories when traditional speech wasn't possible. The boy who had lost his tongue to protect a conspiracy had become the man who found his voice by exposing it. And sometimes, Marcus reflected, the most powerful communication happens not through words, but through the courage to signal the truth when silence would be easier. In the end, Viktor Kozlov had been wrong about one thing. Cutting out Marcus's tongue hadn't silenced him at all. It had simply forced him to learn that there are many ways to speak, and sometimes the most important messages are the ones that don't require a voice. 2 years after the Hague trials, Marcus Brennan stood before a classroom of 20 military veterans at the Denver Rehabilitation Center, demonstrating tactical hand signals that had once saved his life and were now helping others rebuild theirs. The irony wasn't lost on him that losing his voice had led him to become one of the most effective communication instructors in the country. "Communication isn't just about speech," Marcus typed into his electronic voice device, the synthetic voice carrying clearly through the classroom. "It's about connection, understanding, and sometimes survival." Among his students was Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, who had lost her hearing to an IED blast in Afghanistan. Corporal David Kim struggled with traumatic brain injury that made traditional speech difficult. Marine veteran Lisa Rodriguez had developed severe PTSD that left her unable to speak in stressful situations. All of them were learning the tactical signals that Sarah Mitchell had taught Marcus in what felt like another lifetime. "Today we're going to practice situational awareness communication," Marcus's device announced. "These signals can help you communicate danger, request assistance, or coordinate with others when verbal communication is impossible." As his students worked through the exercises, Marcus reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. The international trials had concluded 8 months earlier, resulting in convictions for 47 individuals, including former CIA directors, Pentagon officials, and defense contractors. The conspiracy that had killed thousands of civilians across 3 decades was finally exposed, but the personal cost had been enormous. Sarah Mitchell had testified for 6 weeks at The Hague, providing details about operations that had been buried in classified files for years. Her transformation from a supposedly dead intelligence officer to the star witness in the largest war crimes trial in modern history had made her a global figure, but it had also made her a target for the remaining elements of the conspiracy. Marcus received a text message on his phone: "Emergency meeting, Rebecca's office, 1 hour, come alone, Mrs. S." Sarah rarely contacted him directly anymore. Their shared trauma had created a bond that went beyond friendship, but both of them were trying to build new lives away from the shadows of their intelligence careers. If Sarah was calling an emergency meeting, something significant had happened. Rebecca Martinez's FBI office in downtown Denver looked the same as always, but Marcus could sense tension the moment he entered. Rebecca was there, along with Sarah and 2 people Marcus didn't recognize: a woman in her 50s wearing an expensive suit and a younger man with the bearing of a military officer. "Marcus, meet Director Catherine Wells from the CIA's Office of Inspector General," Rebecca said, gesturing to the woman in the suit, "and Major Jason Burke from Army Criminal Investigation Command." Marcus nodded to both visitors and activated his voice device. "What's this about?" Director Wells opened a briefcase and removed a thick file folder. "Mr. Brennan, we have a problem. 3 individuals who were supposed to be serving life sentences for war crimes have disappeared from federal custody. We believe they're planning retaliation against the key witnesses who testified against them." She slid photographs across the table. Marcus recognized all 3 faces: General Robert Hawkins, who had coordinated weapon shipments to death squads in Central America; Colonel Patricia Stevens, who had provided tactical support for massacres in Eastern Europe; and Dr. Michael Chen, a CIA psychologist who had designed torture protocols used in black site operations. "They escaped?" Marcus typed. Major Burke shook his head. "They were extracted. Professional operation, inside assistance, no casualties among the guards. Someone with significant resources and government connections orchestrated their release." Sarah spoke for the first time since Marcus had arrived. "It gets worse. We've intercepted communications suggesting they're not just planning to eliminate witnesses, they're planning to restart some of the operations we exposed." Rebecca pulled up a map on her laptop showing locations across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. "Intelligence indicates they're attempting to rebuild the network using assets that went underground after the trials. They have funding, equipment, and personnel." Director Wells leaned forward in her chair. "Mr. Brennan, we need your help. You and Captain Mitchell are the only people who fully understand how their communication systems work, how they coordinate operations, and most importantly, how to predict their next moves." Marcus looked around the table at the faces of people who were asking him to return to a world he'd spent 2 years trying to leave behind. He'd built a new life teaching other veterans, helping trauma survivors, and advocating for disability rights. The idea of going back underground, back to the shadows and violence, made his reconstructed throat feel tight. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he typed. Major Burke answered, "We need you to go undercover. These escaped war criminals are recruiting former intelligence operatives who feel betrayed by the trials. Someone with your background and your condition would be particularly valuable to them." "You want me to pretend to be bitter about losing my tongue?" "We want you to pretend to be someone who blames the government for destroying your life," Sarah said quietly. "Someone who might be willing to help them rebuild their operations in exchange for revenge against the people who exposed them." Marcus realized what they were really asking. He would have to infiltrate the remnants of the same conspiracy that had tortured him, killed Sarah's friends, and murdered thousands of innocent people. He would have to pretend to be sympathetic to war criminals while gathering intelligence about their new operations. "It's dangerous," Rebecca admitted. These people know who you are, what you look like, what you've done. If they suspect you're working undercover, they'll kill you without hesitation. But, Director Wells added, you're also the only person who might be able to get close enough to them to prevent what they're planning. Our intelligence suggests they're preparing operations that could kill hundreds or thousands of people. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Denver skyline. 2 years ago, he'd been a quiet maintenance worker who wanted nothing more than to fix machines and drink coffee at Sullivan's bar. Now government agencies were asking him to risk his life again to stop war criminals who had already escaped justice once. But as he thought about his students at the rehabilitation center, veterans who had sacrificed parts of themselves in service to their country, Marcus realized he couldn't walk away from this responsibility. If I do this, he typed, I want full operational control, no handlers, no oversight, no interference from agency politics. And I want Sarah as my backup, not as an official partner, but as someone who can extract me if things go wrong. Director Wells and Major Burke exchanged glances. That's irregular. You're asking for carte blanche to conduct an unauthorized intelligence operation. I'm asking for the freedom to do whatever it takes to stop people who have already proven they're willing to commit genocide for profit, Marcus replied through his device. The regular channels failed to keep these criminals in prison. Maybe it's time to try irregular methods. Sarah smiled grimly. I'm in. But Marcus, you need to understand what you're volunteering for. These people won't just kill you if they discover your real purpose. They'll do to you what Viktor Kozlov did. Except they'll take their time and make sure you suffer. I understand. Rebecca pulled out a secure communication device and handed it to Marcus. This connects directly to a classified operations center. If you get into trouble, if you need extraction, if you discover something critical, you use this and only this to contact us. Over the next week, Marcus underwent intensive preparation for his undercover mission. Agency psychologists helped him develop a believable cover story about becoming radicalized against the government after losing his tongue. Technical specialists provided him with encrypted communication equipment disguised as medical devices. Weapons experts trained him on new firearms and tactical equipment he might need. But the most important preparation came from Sarah, who helped him practice the kind of tactical signals and covert communication methods he would need to gather intelligence while maintaining his cover. Remember, Sarah said during their final training session, these people are smart, paranoid, and ruthless. They'll test you constantly, looking for any sign that you're not who you claim to be. Your disability might actually be an advantage because they'll assume it makes you vulnerable and desperate. Marcus activated his voice device one final time before beginning the mission. Sarah, if something happens to me, make sure my students at the rehabilitation center know that the skills we taught them can be used for more than just communication. Sometimes they're tools for justice. 3 days later, Marcus sat in a dingy bar in Juarez, Mexico, waiting to make contact with representatives of the escaped war criminals. He'd been growing his hair and beard for weeks, developing the appearance of someone who had given up on proper grooming and social conventions. His clothes were deliberately shabby, and he'd practiced displaying the kind of bitter resentment that might make him attractive to people seeking revenge against the American government. When 2 men in expensive suits approached his table, Marcus knew his real test was about to begin. Everything he'd learned about communication, survival, and deception was about to be put to the ultimate trial. But this time, he wasn't just fighting for his own life or to expose past crimes. He was fighting to prevent future atrocities and to protect innocent people who had no idea they were in danger. The man without a tongue was about to find his voice once again, and this time he intended to use it to end the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives, permanently. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.